Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start with a karakia and a few mihi before I do a more formal introduction. So, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, I hi aki ana te atakura, hi tio, hi hoka, hi hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Ko Angela Wanhala tōku ingoa. Ko au te tumuake o te hōtaka hitori, ko Ngāti Moki te whare, ko Taumatu te marae, nō kaitahu hau. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te hunga mate, ki tua atu I te ārai, tai atu ki tētahi o ngā ruanuku tuhitui hitori. Kia Michael King, I whakamaumahara tia nei I te pōnei. Moe mai rā, moe mai rā, moe mai rā. Ka mihi hoki au ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohi, kia kaitahu, kati mamoe, waitaha hoki, tēnā koutou. I mihi nui ki te kai kōrero nei, kia Nicky Hager, he mihi whakawhetai ki a koe, mō tō whakaahai ki te whakamāhuki te tahei wahihira o te hitori o te motu nei, tēnā koe I hoa. And ko taku mihi whakamutunga ki a koutou katoa kua taimai, ki te kauhau o te pō nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here. My name is Angela Wanhala, and as the head of Otago's history program, I'd like to thank you all for being here in person and online this evening for our annual Michael King Memorial Lecture. The history program established this annual lecture in honour of Michael in 2004, the year of his premature death in a car accident. Now, Michael was a popular and very influential historian of New Zealand, whose legacy included over 30 books, which range from general histories to a biography, memoir, and many other pieces of writing. He was greatly admired for his ability to convey the complexities of this country's history to a wide and varied audience, and also for his knowledge of Māori culture and history. The Michael King Memorial Lecture was conceived as a way of giving an afterlife to the spirit of his work. And we are delighted that Nicky Hager has agreed to be the 18th in a very distinguished line of speakers since 2004. And we are sure that his subject would have been of special interest to Michael. And it's now with pleasure that I get to walk away from the microphone and hand it over to my colleague, Associate Professor John Stenhouse, who's going to introduce Nicky tonight. So thank you, John.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks everyone for coming. I met Nicky Hager first in the early 1970s. We were classmates at Palmerston North Boys High School. Initially, all I knew was that Nicky came from Levin and that his father made high-quality shirts. Later I learned that the Nazis had driven the family out of Austria. Neither of us felt entirely comfortable with our school's traditional masculine ethos. Nicky struck me as gentle, independent-minded, and at times a bit of a stirrer. After high school, he studied physics and philosophy at Victoria, while I studied history at Massey with Bill Oliver. Over the years, he popped up in the papers and on TV as he built a remarkable career as an investigative journalist and author. His books include Secret Power, 1996, Secrets and Lies, 1999, Seeds of Distrust, 2002, The Hollow Men, 2006, Other People's Wars, 2011, and Hit and Run, 2017, on the New Zealand SAS in Afghanistan. A friend gave me Nicky's 2014 book, Dirty Politics, How Attack Politics is Poisoning New Zealand's Political Environment. Although at first I wasn't quite sure about the title, I started reading and couldn't stop. As an historian trained to read sources critically, I thought that Nicky supported his arguments with plenty of evidence, fairly and accurately interpreted. The book rang true. Discussing it afterward with my colleague, Professor Liam McIlvanney, we agreed that what shocked us most about dirty politics was that more New Zealanders weren't shocked by it. Professor Sir David Skegg, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago from 2004 to 2011, cited dirty politics approvingly in his splendid 2019 book, The Health of the People. Many of the same bloggers, journalists for hire, politicians, and multinational corporations whose dirty politics Nicky had exposed, Skegg showed, worked to dismantle the public health task force that he had been appointed to lead during the 1990s, costing the country, in the long run, billions of dollars and thousands of lives. I've enjoyed reconnecting with Nicky on recent research trips to Wellington. I admire his courage, honesty, decency, and commitment to telling the truth, come what may. It's my privilege to invite him to deliver the 2023 Michael King Memorial Lecture, The Battle for and Against New Zealand's Nuclear-Free Policy, A Secret History. Nicky.
Kia ora tātou. Can you hear me clearly? Thank you for coming. I'm obviously in very good company. I'm also honoured to be speaking on the Michael King Memorial Lecture. And I thank the organisers for trusting me. And I also thank the organisers for organising it when the university is in a time of trouble and turmoil. Because it's a very formal and important thing to give a memorial lecture, I've written a lecture, which those of you who speak publicly will know is not the best way to give a speech. But I decided that we will lose in presentation, you will hopefully gain in precision and referencing and things. So it has to be. Michael King was an important part of the intellectual environment that I and many of you grew up in. His prolific work as a writer suggested lives that we could possibly lead. His Penguin History of New Zealand was the first general history of New Zealand I read personally, expanding my understanding of the country I live in and sparking my interest in reading more history, a subject which had been almost absent from my education, my science-based secondary school and university education. I remember how when I read the Penguin History of New Zealand, there was one subject I wished he'd covered more fully, it being a subject which I knew about myself. It seems fitting to use this memorial lecture to describe in more detail this one of the numerous subjects that Michael could only address briefly when he was covering the whole human history of New Zealand in one book. The subject I've chosen, as you know already, is the momentous but not fully understood events of 1985, when against great resistance, New Zealand banned nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed warships from New Zealand. A national-scale protest against nuclear weapons. The setting for this story is the late Cold War. The conflict was feeling close to home for us in the South Pacific, with nuclear weapon testing happening on our doorstep, and great pressure for New Zealand to align ourselves with the British and American foreign policies. The South Pacific was also being used as a base for secret nuclear command and control facilities. It was a huge thing for our 3 million strong, ex-British colony, good old country, to refuse to fall into line with the Anglo-American allies and distance itself from the nuclear arms race. Like other major public interest, social and political change in New Zealand, the nuclear-free policy was strongly resisted, vigorously fought for, and eventually became part of the national identity of the country. The nuclear-free policy was the product of a huge outpouring of public concern and energy. When the last nuclear-armed and powered US warship visited Wellington in August 1983, like exactly 40 years ago practically, the USS Texas, was met by a flotilla of protest boats at the harbour mouth, by trade union strikes on the wharves, protest services in the central city churches, school student protests, Women for Peace protests, a 10,000 people march through the central city, accompanied by a parade of grotesque sculptures built by the city's artists, all the culmination of years of organising, debate and protest. The Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific movement connected the New Zealand protests into a Pacific-wide struggle. David Lange, then leader of the opposition, called the Texas visit a calculated, unfriendly act by the American government in cahoots with the national government. Less than a year after the Texas visit, David Lange's Labour government was elected to power. And to the disbelief and anger of the US and Australian governments, the nuclear-free policy was adopted by Cabinet. A few years after that, public opinion was so strong that the National Party adopted the nuclear-free policy as well. It was made of generations of public feelings about nuclear weapons and anti-war feelings dating from the horrors of the First World War and later the Vietnam War. No government has dared to change it since. But it could have all been different. There was a major counter-campaign that tried to stop the nuclear-free policy ever being born. That's the subject of this lecture, which you can read behind me, The Battle for and Against New Zealand's Nuclear-Free Policy, A Secret History, where the secret history part refers to hopefully interesting new information that I can add to the story for the first time tonight. The lessons of this piece of history are very relevant today and what they show about the way officials work to influence government foreign and defence policy, lessons that may help us to understand and spot when the same politics play out today. A year before David Lange was elected in New Zealand, a new Labour government was elected in Australia as well, headed by the Prime Minister Bob Hawke. A New York Times article explained what happened there. The Australian Labour Party, it said, when out of office, campaigned on an anti-nuclear platform. After taking office in 1983, Mr. Hawke agreed to continue military ties with the United States, including visits by nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed warships. It was assumed by opponents of the New Zealand policy, inside and outside the country, that our new Labour government, would do the same as the Australian government and drop the promised ban on visits by nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed ships. The example of supposedly nuclear-free Japan also pointed this way. The same New York Times article noted that Japan, which has long had a policy of banning nuclear weapons from its territory, has not forced the United States to affirm each time a ship visits that it does not carry nuclear weapons. What this meant in practice was that Japan routinely had US aircraft carriers and other vessels that were very likely to be equipped with nuclear weapons. The Japanese policy was, and still is, simply a sham. The idea amongst opponents of New Zealand's nuclear-free policy was that it should be the same as Japan, where the US Navy would neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons on the ships, visiting warship, and the New Zealand government would adopt an official stance of glibly trusting that the vessels would conform with our nuclear-free policy. In the same vein, the head of Lange's Prime Minister's Department, who hated the policy, Gerald Hensley, pointed to the example of Spain and Denmark, which he said, quote, this is a ridiculous quote, but listen to it, had decided that the interests of their alliance made it worthwhile to accept an occasional few days of uncertainty about the temporary presence of nuclear weapons in their harbours. In short, there was a quietly comfortable assumption amongst the opponents that David Lange's Labour government would drop the policy or agree to a meaningless trust-based nuclear-free policy as these other countries had done. Plans were being made during the second half of 1984 for a visit to New Zealand by a US destroyer, which would serve as a test case for the sellout of the nuclear-free policy. Most of the people here will know what happened next. There was a massive public uproar. The US warship visit was refused, and the nuclear-free policy came into existence. But we know much less about the forces that came close to defeating the nuclear-free policy before it even came into being. I will describe this counter-campaign shortly, but first I should explain something about the new information that I can bring to this lecture. A few weeks ago, by chance, a friend of mine was researching in the Turnbull Library in Wellington and came across an old newspaper clipping that he thought I would be interested to see. The article looked back from a year after the US destroyer was barred from visiting New Zealand and explained the events that stopped New Zealand backing down on its nuclear-free policy. The article reads, "After months of negotiations with the American government, the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defence last January were apparently sure that a visit by a US warship would mean the government's anti-nuclear were apparently sure that a visit by a US warship would meet the government's anti-nuclear policy and hold the ANZUS alliance intact. Then some members of the government caucus and the Coalition Against Nuclear Warships stepped in. As I'm still quoting the newspaper. The visit was cancelled. But what is the Coalition Against Nuclear Warships, and how good is its information? The newspaper asked. Today, the Post profiles the Coalition Against Nuclear Warships. Profiles the Coalition Against Nuclear Warships. Sorry. Today. That's funny. Today, the Post profiles Coalition Against Nuclear Warships, the organisation headed by a 26-year-old who apparently had a more profound influence over our defence and foreign policy than the state's own institutions. You'll see why I was kept falling over that. The 26-year-old, looking more like 16 years old than 26 in the accompanying photograph, was me. In an earlier life before my current career. I was there during the events covered by this lecture, which means I can contribute some first-hand information about this piece of history, including things that have stayed secret until now. I've been thinking for a long time about recording this history, but I waited until it felt right to tell things where I'd been sworn to secrecy. Now, with the passage of time, nearly everyone I'm going to mention is dead, and anyway, I think they would only be proud of the things which I'm going to reveal. I need to reassure that I'm not claiming some special determining role for myself in the story of New Zealand becoming nuclear free. I had great respect for David Lange, and I believe that various people, including him, Helen Clark, and the Labour Party President Margaret Wilson, played the really crucial roles. And like all people power campaigns, numerous other people played important roles, each building on the efforts of the people before them. But I was spokesperson and strategist for the nuclear-free campaign in the capital city, which means I was particularly aware of the who and the how of the effort to sabotage the policy. I can add these new pieces to the story here today. The Labour government was elected in as many of you will remember, was elected in the July 1984 snap election. Its campaign emphasised the nuclear-free policy, with election billboards promising that New Zealand would stay nuclear-free. 4 days after the election, Lange was asked if the nuclear-free policy was in any way negotiable. He said no, it was a policy and the declared position of the government, full stop. Meanwhile, Foreign Affairs officials advised the new Labour government ministers to agree with the Americans on a 6-month cooling down period, while the details of the nuclear-free policy were worked out. Various commentators later claimed that Lange was not committed to the policy and was open to watering it down. In this view, Lange intended to use the 6 months cooling down period to wriggle out of the policy, but then was forced into it by his party and had to stick to it. I don't believe that for a second. However, it would become clear that the United States officials fully expected Lange to water down the policy, and so from the beginning there was a collision coming, when the election promised to make New Zealand nuclear-free by banning nuclear-armed and powered warships had to be reconciled with the American expectation that there was going to be another Australia and Japanese-style accommodation, meaning a back-down by New Zealand. The 6-month cooling down period was due to end in January 1985. That was when the Labour government had to decide whether to accept a US Navy request for one of its warships to visit New Zealand. All the negotiations were occurring in secret, but my colleagues and I began to feel suspicious that a backdown was being prepared. The government had continued to insist that they would not allow nuclear ships into New Zealand, but it started talking about officials arranging a special process for making decisions on whether to approve US ship visit requests. The process did not require the US Navy to confirm or deny the presence of nuclear weapons on a visiting ship, something it refused to do, and instead was based on the idea that the New Zealand military staff could reliably advise the government on whether particular US warships obeyed the nuclear-free policy. For people paying close attention, the clue to what was being planned could be seen in Longy's statements that said, for instance here in late 1984, the government, assisted by the Defence Department and its researchers, would make an assessment on whether ships were likely to be carrying nuclear arms. This could sound reasonable, but the giveaway word was likely. Ships that were likely to be carrying nuclear arms. Likely and not likely were not good enough because they both implied possibly nuclear armed. Likely suggested a strategy for defeating the nuclear-free policy. First, a ship could be allowed to visit that was not very likely to be nuclear armed, but still possibly could be. And then once on the slippery slope, a succession of warships and submarines could come, each progressively more likely to be nuclear armed. Before long, we would be no different from nuclear-free Japan, with US vessels coming and going as they pleased. This is what we started to suspect, and as we'll see shortly, is precisely what the officials were planning. Based on these suspicions, we began urgent action to try to make it more difficult politically for the officials to get away with this trick. On the 2nd of December 1984, about 8 weeks before the US ship decision date, I published an 11-page document containing a list of all nuclear armed and powered ships and submarines in the US Navy. The introduction said, the list includes all those United States warships and submarines specifically prohibited from visiting New Zealand by the Labour government's anti-nuclear policy. In practice, the list identified vessels that were equipped with systems for launching and targeting nuclear weapons, since we would not know which ones were actually carrying nuclear weapons on board at any given moment. By getting in first with the list and spreading it around the journalists and political people interested in the nuclear-free issue, the idea was that any warship announced to be visiting New Zealand would be immediately compared to the published list. I backed up the list with public statements saying that if any vessel on this list was invited to New Zealand, it would be met with massive protests. In the following weeks, we introduced a further concept, which was that the nuclear-free policy had to ban all nuclear-capable vessels. Again, we were trying to take away the wriggle room. Since no one could know for sure which vessels actually had nuclear weapons on board, a genuine policy had to ban all vessels which were capable of launching nuclear weapons. There was a showdown coming. If the government allowed a visit by a warship with systems capable of launching nuclear weapons, in other words, possibly nuclear armed, the nuclear-free policy was over. If they refused to visit, the nuclear-free policy was set in stone. Thus, the scene was set. In the decades since these events, many once secret documents have been released. They show that our suspicions about the counter-campaign were exactly right. New Zealand officials from Defence, Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister's Department told Longy and other ministers that it would be possible to have a strict ban on nuclear armed and powered warships and to stay in the military ANZUS alliance. The officials told them that they could negotiate a diplomatic solution with the Americans that honoured Labour's nuclear-free policy. But they then set out to undermine the nuclear-free policy. That's the officials, I mean. New Zealand officials travelled back and forward to the United States in the later months of 1984, working on this plan. The documents show them working on the plan when military officers would assess whether visiting ships were nuclear-free, but they also show us what the government was not being told. In private, there was an understanding at the heart of the negotiations between our officials in the United States. And what heart of negotiations, that New Zealand would offer the Americans what Secretary of Foreign Affairs Merv Norrish called a step-by-step progress towards an accommodation. Starting with ships less likely to be nuclear armed during the visit and moving towards what they called normal port access, including inevitably nuclear-armed warships. The New Zealand position, quote, may well have to incorporate an element of trust, Norris told his colleagues. The US Deputy Secretary of State sent a telegram to New Zealand officials in November, that's November 1984, saying that while the first warship might be unlikely to be nuclear-armed, the US could accept this as a first step to restoring full access, but not as the final position. The New Zealand Chief of Defence Staff, Ewan Jamieson, the military officer who would be given the job of assessing the nuclear status of visiting ships, spoke of, quote, a ladder of increasingly sensitive visits. And the US Secretary of State, George Shultz, said it explicitly. Over time, he said, quote, over time, you would have to assume that our vessels would carry nuclear arms. It was a slippery slope that we had suspected. When David Lange said publicly that the nuclear ship ban was non-negotiable, I believe he really meant it. When he said publicly that New Zealand officials could make judgments about which ships were non-nuclear, he was believing that the officials could deliver a solution that didn't compromise a nuclear-free policy. But he was being misled. I now head into the parts of the story which have stayed secret until now. The crunch came in late January 1985, at the end of the 6-month cooling down period. The US request for a visit by a US Navy ship had been received in secret by the government, and the government's decision was scheduled to be made at the Monday Cabinet meeting on the 28th of January 1985. Lange was away on a trip to Tokelau and would arrive back midway through the Cabinet meeting in time for the ship visit decision. Over the preceding weekend, nuclear-free groups and Labour Party members had mobilised people around the country, in fact I guarantee probably including people in this room, to send 7,000 telegrams and letters to Lange, urging him to not back down on the policy. Overflowing mailbags greeted him in the Beehive on the Monday. But there are, of course, many times when the public campaigns hard just like this and it doesn't win. Those involved in the counter-campaign had also been preparing for months. They had on their side particularly the threat that New Zealand's Anglo-American allies would be furious and punish New Zealand if Labour didn't back down on the policy. Senior officials set out their recommendations in 4 documents for the Labour government. The Chief of Defence Staff wrote in the cover letter that, quote, in the interest of security, I've had only 3 copies of each paper produced. The first copy was for the Minister of Defence, the second for Lange on his return, and, he wrote, I hold the third in my office. I recommend that no wider access be given to these papers until the Prime Minister has considered their advice and given direction on how the matter should be progressed. Secrecy and timing are powerful tools of bureaucratic influence. Thus, after 6 months of preparation, the Defence Minister was being given only the one weekend to mull over the advice. Lange would have only a few hours, and no other ministers would see the papers before the decision was made. Only one option was offered. The officials had stacked the process in their favour. Notice that this meant that the only Cabinet Minister, indeed the only person, who was to be allowed to see the senior officials' advice before Cabinet met and Lange arrived, was the Minister of Defence. And then something incredibly lucky happened, which is where we move into the new information. On that final, fateful weekend, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was the Minister of Defence. He was a Labour Party politician named Franco Flynn, whom I'd had no close contact with before. He asked if I was free to visit him at his home in Grant Road, Wellington. He said it was urgent. When I'd arrived and was sitting in his very neat living room, he said he had the bundle of advice from the officials on whether to accept the US ship visit. But he said he wasn't sure what to make of the advice or what he should do. Would I confidentially read the official documents he had received and tell him what I thought? And so there I was, reading the secret advice that almost no one else had seen. 2 Ministry of Defence documents were stamped secret, and 2 more came from the External Intelligence Bureau. Franco Flynn was breaking the law by showing them to me, And I was a little bemused, wondering why he'd trusted me. And then I was engrossed in the documents. The papers named the ship that the US Navy wanted to visit New Zealand, a destroyer called the USS Buchanan. I recognised the name, which only weeks earlier I had included in the Coalition Against Nuclear Warships list of all US nuclear warships and submarines that were banned from New Zealand under the nuclear-free policy. The official advice also had 36 pages of facts and arguments, all supporting the ship visit proposal, i.e. supporting the ship visiting. I therefore offer for your consideration, the Chief of Defence Staff Jamieson wrote, my assessment that it was most unlikely that the USS Buchanan, at the time of its proposed visit to New Zealand, would carry any nuclear weapons. It was exactly what we'd feared. There was no mention of the step-by-step plan to undermine the ban with increasingly blatant nuclear-armed ships, nor was there mention that the US Secretary of State had said over time you would have to assume some of our vessels would carry nuclear arms. There was actually no discussion at all of pros and cons. There was not a single mention of the option of adopting a strong nuclear-free policy. No other options of any kind were provided. The government basically had been manoeuvred into a corner where it was hard to say no. It had agreed to the officials conducting the 6-month diplomatic negotiations, implying that the nuclear-free policy was open to negotiation and that compromise was possible. The Americans would feel messed around and were likely to punish the country if the Labour government stood firm. It was classic bureaucratic stitch-up. It was a classic bureaucratic stitch-up, the kind where the officials usually win. Foreign Affairs had already drafted a letter announcing the ship visit. There was, of course, no letter already drafted for the government declining the ship visit. But something unpredictable had happened, which was Franco Flynn inviting me to his home at the critical moment, when official secrecy should have been depriving him of support and advice. After months of living and breathing these things, I was well prepared to help him figure out how to protect the nuclear-free policy, which is what he wanted to do. There were two crucial things I was able to tell him. First, I explained exactly why accepting the Buchanan would be the end of the nuclear-free policy. I said that once one possibly nuclear-armed ship was allowed to visit, even if maybe not very likely that first time, New Zealand would never be able to say no to all the other possibly nuclear-armed warships and submarines. Over time, it would become evident to everyone that we had a Japan-style nuclear-free policy, meaning a nuclear-free policy only in name. It was a trick to end the nuclear-free policy. Showing him the secret documents, I directed him to the only sentence that really mattered, which is where Jamieson had written that he could, quote, give no absolute guarantee that the ship does not carry nuclear warheads. This was the line he could take to Cabinet. The other thing I was able to suggest to O'Flynn also proved to be important. As I've said, after 6 months of work, the government was being presented with only one option. The long-awaited Cabinet meeting had no alternative proposals, no option B to choose instead. I had an idea for a plan. When I'd researched the list of all the nuclear-armed and powered US Navy ships, most US Navy ships and submarines, in fact, by far, were installed with nuclear weapon systems. But I remembered one modern class of guided missile frigates that had no nuclear weapon systems. It was called the Oliver Hazard Perry class. Remember this name. I suggested to Frank O'Flynn that he propose to Cabinet that they reject the visit by the Buchanan, but tell the Americans that the government would accept the visit by a warship from the Oliver Hazard Perry class, which would clearly fit the New Zealand policy. The ship could come and go without breaching the nuclear-free policy, and if it did come, there would not be a precedent for later visits by nuclear-capable ships. So the Labour potentially had an option B. It gave them a way out. I left Frank O'Flynn mulling over what to do. This is how it played out. Longy was still away that weekend with no secure communications. On the Sunday afternoon, Deputy Prime Minister Geoffrey Palmer hand-typed a letter to Longy, bringing him up to date with the developments on the nuclear-free issue. It was hand-delivered to Longy by a trusted advisor as he returned to New Zealand. Years later, Palmer's letter was released under the Official Information Act, so we know what he said. Evidence about whether this vessel carries nuclear weapons had been assessed by individuals, Palmer wrote. He said the evidence was enclosed. I have not yet seen it, he said. Frank has, meaning Frank O'Flynn. He says it's his view that the evidence was not sufficient to convince the public that it will not be carrying weapons, and therefore we should refuse the request. Longy did not arrive at Cabinet the next day. Did not arrive at Cabinet the next day until the afternoon, and the nuclear ship discussion was surprisingly short. Longy later said it was only about 15 minutes. It's clear that he and O'Flynn simply presented their conclusions to the rest of the ministers. A report of the meeting records that Longy told Cabinet that Buchanan was not suitable, and he intended to ask the Americans for another ship, one from the Oliver Hazard Perry class. At the post-cabinet press conference, Longy declined to name the ship proposed by the Americans, but said that there were vessels in the US Navy, quote, modern, recent fighting vessels, which were clearly, unmistakably not nuclear armed. It was clear what class of ships he was referring to. Until the press conference, officials had no idea that their proposal to accept the Buchanan had been rejected, nor that an option B had appeared that gave the government a way out of having to accept the officials' proposals. The next day, Longy and O'Flynn had a meeting with the American ambassador, Munro Brown. Longy explained that there was insufficient evidence that Buchanan would not be nuclear armed, and he proposed instead a visit by an Oliver Hazard Perry frigate. O'Flynn added that it would give the opportunity for a port visit. Wasn't that what the Americans wanted? The US ambassador blew up at this suggestion, saying, no, we want port access. What we want is resumption of the way we operated in ANZUS as before. The US ambassador reluctantly agreed to pass on the Oliver Hazard Perry proposal to Washington. But the US government replied that the only option was the Buchanan, not an Oliver Hazard Perry frigate. There had never been any real chance that the US was going to accept New Zealand sticking to the nuclear-free policy. At this point, Longy formally refused the Buchanan, and the nuclear-free policy was secure. The rest is well known. As the US retaliation began in the very first days after the Buchanan decision, O'Flynn sent out a press release as Minister of Defence. The government's defence advisers left it in no doubt that a refusal to accept visits by nuclear-capable ships would almost inevitably result in curtailment by the US of current activities under ANZUS, he said. The US might remove concessions for military equipment and purchases, but he was, quote, sure most New Zealanders will be willing to pay the price to see the government stand firm. He said exercises might also be cancelled and the flow of intelligence reduced or stopped. Our defence advisers warned us of all these probable consequences of our nuclear-free policy, he said. We're prepared for them and their cost, and I'm sure New Zealanders are too. Later that year, the American government very publicly expelled New Zealand from the ANZUS alliance, which I personally regarded as a bonus. The New Zealand officials kept trying in secret through the rest of 1985 to engineer a US warship visit and get the step-by-step plan back on track, but suffice to say their efforts failed. An overly aggressive reaction to the nuclear ship ban by the US and Australian governments, and then the Rainbow Warrior bombing the same year that the US and British governments refused to condemn, had greatly strengthened New Zealand public support for the nuclear-free policy. There was, for me, one final mystery surrounding the Buchanan decision. Why had the Minister of Defence, Frank O'Flynn, reached out to me at that crucial moment? I learned the answer in a chance meeting many years later. It wasn't that O'Flynn had heard me in the news or anything like that. It was something much more pleasingly New Zealand. Back on that January 1985 weekend, Frank O'Flynn had been pacing around his house in Grant Road, complaining to his family that he didn't know what to make of the advice he was reading, I was told. He asked, who can I talk to who would be trustworthy? It was Frank's daughter, Bridget O'Flynn, who had the idea. Some years earlier, she had been a postgraduate student in the philosophy department at Victoria University, where all good things happen. At the same time as I was in the postgraduate history of philosophy. We sat around and talked sometimes. It was her, bless her. She told her father she knew me and I'd be reliable. She'd always been proud about that and had wanted to tell me. She had connected us up at the right moment. Franco Flynn and I were friends for the rest of his life. There was a warmth between us when we met, which I think was in part an acknowledgement that I'd kept our meeting secret. Later, when he left Wellington, he invited me to his house again. This time he gave me all the boxes of his papers from his time as Minister of Defence. They were a goldmine, including important New Zealand eyes-only documents that would later go into my first book. Likewise, by the way, as another sign of the personal goodwill coming out of those years, David Longy wrote the foreword for that first book. I want to say a few words of praise about the little-remembered Franco Flynn. He was solidly in the progressive Labour Party tradition on foreign policy. In September 1984, for instance, as the nuclear decision approached, he gave a foreign policy speech that enraged US officials. Since World War II, he said, New Zealand has been part of, quote, a kind of United States protectorate. But the country was, quote, no longer under any obligation for traditional or historical reasons to recognise every enemy of Britain or the United States as our enemy at all times. He urged that New Zealand not get drawn into global and regional pacts all over the world. The modern Labour Party, in my opinion, needs more people who understand and care about foreign policy as much as he did. Before I finish, which is soon, partly because we won't have time for questions, which I look forward to, before I finish, there's a final point I want to make. In those first years of the Longy Labour government, an informal group of senior officials was formed to try to stop the nuclear-free policy harming the ANZUS alliance. They were all the most senior officials responsible for New Zealand's military and foreign policy. To be specific, the group consisted of the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Merv Norrish, the Chief of Defence Staff, Ewan Jamieson, the Secretary of Defence, Dennis McLean, and the head of the Prime Minister's Department, Gerald Hensley. They met informally during the crucial 6-month period, devising and attempting to push through the plan I've described. This was, for me, as someone involved, the biggest lesson I had from the experience. I'd had a growing realisation about who we were up against. I realised that the greatest opponents of the nuclear-free policy were not the National Party or some, crazy pro-military group or even the US government. Our greatest opponents were the New Zealand officials. They were also the greatest opponents of the government they were supposed to serve, a government that had campaigned and been elected on the promise of a nuclear ban and was then trying to fulfil its promise. This is an important New Zealand story, and understanding it helps us to understand more widely that something's very wrong with defence and foreign policy in New Zealand. We have a government based on the principle of civilian control of the military, and equally government control of foreign affairs. But the events I've described today are about senior officials who believed they knew best, and more worryingly, who felt entitled to trick, block, and steer the government to pursue the policies they preferred. They seemed to assume, and in Franco Flynn's words, a kind of United States protectorate, where doing what the United States or Britain wanted was more important than thinking about and pursuing what was best for New Zealand. Or to put another way, they thought that what was best for New Zealand was doing whatever the United States and Britain wanted of us. This attitude hasn't changed. In the decades since the nuclear showdown, I've seen the same thing again and again. Strong political leaders can sometimes wrestle control, like Helen Clark refusing to join the invasion of Iraq, when military and foreign affairs staff were reflexively trying to push New Zealand into it. But on most issues, most of the time, the same non-democratic grouping of the heads of defence, foreign affairs and Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet have far more influence over defence and foreign policy than the elected politicians, and vastly more influence than the members of the public. Take, for example, the recent move to have New Zealand become a NATO partner in the so-called Indo-Pacific, or the move to have our small South Pacific nation join the anti-China AUKUS alliance. I see these as driven almost entirely by pro-American officials. It was the same with my personal experience in the Operation Burnham inquiry, which investigated my book on civilian casualties in Afghanistan and found that indeed civilian casualties and torture had been hidden and denied. As I went through that inquiry, I became aware, and later confirmed under the Official Information Act, that there was an informal grouping of, yes, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the Chief of Defence Force, the Secretary of Defence, the Head of the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, the same configuration as fought the nuclear ship ban, this time fighting every step of the way to try to stop critical findings about the actions of our SAS in the US-led war. And believe it or not, some of those senior officials, particularly in foreign affairs, still have their eyes on the nuclear-free policy. So most of this lecture has been about some important and triumphant history. History that deserves to be told from the perspective of the Lange government and the public. But I also want to urge that we learn from this history and realise that very serious reform is needed to our present-day military and foreign policy bureaucracy.
Thank you, Nicky, so much for a wonderful lecture. It's been, I think, a real privilege to have you here with us and to have the opportunity to listen to your personal reflections, which is fantastic, and to have an opportunity to kind of really hear from your perspective of what's going on behind the scenes at the time. We do have a little bit of time for questions. Nicky is being very kind and generous and allowing us an opportunity to have a bit of Q&A. So John and I are going to be managing that as best possible. I have very terrible eyesight for distance, so John is going to tell me where to run to kind of bring this microphone to you so that you can ask any questions that you wish. So please feel free to ask away. Well, we've got the just over here. All right, I'll run. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that talk. Really enjoyed it. Thanks. Can you remind us when the Rainbow Warrior was? Was it in 1985? And do you think that there was any tie-up with what you're talking about here? And can you elaborate a little bit on the degree to which the Americans were sort of punitive and, you know, in response to our nuclear policy?
Gladly. I don't think that anyone engineered the Rainbow Warrior bombing to try to influence New Zealand. That was the French government and its great wisdom. But what they did, so when it was a shocking thing they did, but it had an unintended consequence, which it meant that it really took the nuclear-free policy from being something which maybe half the population believed in to something which most of the population believed in. So unintended consequences were off the scale. But what was the second half of your question?
To what extent did the Americans kind of punish us for our decision?
Well, this was also interesting. The Americans punished us. They didn't have trade sanctions, for example, which would have just seemed kind of like too over the top. But they did. They cancelled exercises. They cut off some intelligence, although not as much as they said. They made very angry noises. But the thing about it was, the important thing to remember from a New Zealand point of view is that it wasn't for New Zealand consumption. The reason they did it was not to influence New Zealand. The reason they did it was because they were scared that Japan might follow us, or Denmark, or all those other countries which would like to have a similar policy but which had been talked out of it. And so what we got was really a retaliation which was a lack of regard for New Zealand, a disinterest in New Zealand, and really just kind of bashing us and making sure that they showed how mad they were to try to stop other countries doing the same. So we were just a convenient way of trying to stop the contagion.
I wonder what your old friend Franco Flynn would have thought of Andrew Little when he was challenged about the recent discussions over cozying up to NATO and AUKUS. He says, I know whose side we're on.
I can tell you Franco Flynn turned in his grave.
That's too many people. I'm going to go to the front and then I'm going to come up here. This is good exercise for me.
Thank you for your talk, Nikki. As I'm from Japan, I'm very disappointed to hear how not great our policy is. And as you might know, I mean, this nuclear policy, I don't think covers nuclear power stations, but I was wondering if you have any advice on, as you might know, currently Japanese government is releasing the contaminated water into the Pacific, and I wonder what role New Zealand could play in stopping it.
What?
What role New Zealand government could play to stop the new Japanese government from releasing this nuclear water to the Pacific, because Pacific is obviously connected to New Zealand.
Okay. Thank you. You talked about Japan and nuclear weapons. I think it's really important for us and for Japan to recognize what Japan is in kind of great power competition, which is that if you know Japan, if you've been there, I've traveled around Japan and gone to military bases and gone to intelligence bases, and Japan essentially functions as a permanent aircraft carrier off the coast of China and the Eastern Soviet Union. So the story about Japan being not properly nuclear free is just part of a much bigger story of being permanently available in numerous ways to the United States military. On what you're saying about the Japanese government proposing to release the contaminated water into the Pacific, you've already thinking this yourself. I would have hoped that New Zealand and other countries would put aside other trade and other thoughts and make a much louder noise than they have been. That's all I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you for pointing me in the right direction. I told you I had really bad eyesight. Now, where am I going? Up here, all the way up the back.
Hello. Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. But I'm just wondering about your thoughts as in future, as Don Brash elegantly put it, about the worries that the New Zealand nuclear policy could be gone by lunchtime.
I would say of all the policies which are sort of were created by the left side of politics, it's one of the safest ones from change. Luckily, I believe this, luckily it has gone from being fragile to being very solid, and I don't think that's changed generationally. I think it's just kind of cemented in, and it's a kind of a really solid part of the non-Anglo-American mainstream of New Zealand thought and self-perception and things. So I don't feel it's in great peril at all. However, the reason I mentioned about some people in foreign affairs having their eyes on the policy is I've been hearing stories in Wellington which have amazed me, which is that after all these years, there are people there who still want to undo the offence of New Zealand acting independently like that. So while I feel a high confidence that they won't get away with it, I think that there either are now or there will be attempts yet again of the kind that I've been talking about. Thanks.
Kia ora, Nicky, up here. Very long way away. I hope this question's okay. It's not directly related to...
Go for your life.
Okay, great. You mentioned the flotilla and the peace protests against the ship in August 1983.
Yeah.
And we have such a strong history of activism in this country, but yet now we're experiencing kind of what I would view as dismay, apathy. I know you're running part of a fantastic campaign that's going on at the moment, but just wondering, how do you think we might reinvigorate and re-energise that momentum again for, you know, what we had? I mean, you know, I was like 14 back there and just in awe of what was happening around the country. And I was in Auckland, and then there was the Rainbow Warrior thing and the Springbok tour, and you know, before that, and now I just feel like I'm constantly pushing the boat up the wrong way of the stream, and yeah.
I understand. A lot of people feel like you do. I totally do not buy the theory that there were the good old days and they're gone. I just don't believe that. I don't believe that for a second. I think that, what's the answer? Organise, 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 and keep organising. That's the answer. And that's what the right does when the right wants to go somewhere, and that's what the left does and that's what the environmentalists do. It's the answer. And if something's not working, then try a new way. That's what I think. And we owe it to other people. Politics is a social activity. If people don't see anyone else being active, then they live other lives and they don't realise it can be part of their lives. And if they see people being active and achieving things, well, then they believe in it and they want to be part of it. And so the best way to make more people active is to be active ourselves and to keep on being active and to be persistent until we succeed.
Getting there. It really is good exercise.
Thanks so much, Nicky, for that talk. I just wondered, you touched on it briefly, but it's the echoes of this period with the current kind of AUKUS developments. But I guess the interesting parallel is, Franco Flynn talking about New Zealand as a kind of protectorate is kind of happening in the heyday of kind of US hegemony. And kind of AUKUS is actually a kind of representation of a kind of declining US hegemony. So what are your thoughts basically on what is AUKUS, what is New Zealand's relationship to AUKUS, and what might be the way that we actually deal with AUKUS, or what might be a path forward for New Zealand?
Might what, sorry?
What will be a path forward for New Zealand?
All right. First of all, I don't think the United States for a moment thinks that the sun is setting on it. In fact, it's going the other way at the moment in our region, and that the confrontation with China is, as you all know, being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. Not in a way which could resolve and go away at some stage, but at the moment it's not. Sorry, I'm tired. What was your question again?
Basically, what's New Zealand's, how do New Zealand respond to AUKUS in the context of that relationship between the US and China?
I've got a really particular view of this. I think that I've said this before, you may have heard me say it, I think there are two really separate tracks in New Zealand of foreign policy thought. And one is the nuclear-free, more independent, don't go off to Iraq, we don't have to do those things, why on earth would we want to be part of a war with China, etc. There's one track which I would say has the vast majority of the public there. And then there's another track which usually acts by stealth because it's not very popular and doesn't really, doesn't try to debate in public very much because it's not going to get its way, which is represented more by the officials and some of the specialist interests around the American alliance. And I think with things like this, the answer lies so there's these two the great sort of river of where New Zealanders are going, which is towards a more independent, more Polynesian country, and this other stuck in the Anglo-American past. And what I think, and it's the same with AUKUS and it's the same with everything, is that the only reason why they can make progress on the Anglo-American track, the main reason they can is by secrecy. Most of those things are not debated. Most of those things are not known, or at least not till afterwards. Most of them, if they are going, are justified with fake excuses, which are trying hard to kind of find some point of contact with where the public feels like maybe that we're helping make a better world by being in Afghanistan or something, you know. But basically, if it can be done in quiet and secret, it will keep going. And if it can't be done in secret, it won't keep going. And that implies an obvious strategy. We have to talk about it more. And I think the world's got so many interesting things to work on that we've gone through a period where there haven't been many people who have been focusing on foreign policy. And so what's the answer? The answer is that there is this great ocean in New Zealand public and belief and culture and things, which is heading away from that kind of world, which is ready to be tapped by people who are active, but there need to be people who are writing, talking, thinking and doing, and then we will get our way. That's what I believe.
Sorry, I have to run around the other side now.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question about if you can tell us anything about the consequences for Franco Flynn. So after that cabinet meeting, his officials must have thought, where did he get this crazy idea for, option B, right? And they wouldn't have been stupid. They would have thought that he must have got it from somewhere. And I know that the rest of his political career was not seen as a great success. And I wonder if that's just a coincidence, or if maybe he told you something about what happened afterwards.
Yes, delightful actually. Luckily, we have quite a good record of what the officials thought, because 3 of them wrote books about it. They were so frustrated that they'd lost. I've just reread those books preparing for this, and they had all sorts of variations of trying to work out where the Oliver Hazard Perry sailed in from. But that doesn't matter anyway. But the point is that they were deeply aggrieved that they had got manoeuvred out of it somehow. Did it hurt Franco Flynn? I don't think so. He said to me, he was a modest man. He said to me when he'd been in Parliament a bit longer, he said, "Won't be long now, and I'll be writing letters for the Dominion Post." That's okay. I'll just keep trying in the way I can. So he didn't seem to me to have suffered at all. He was happy with his work, and he deserved to be.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I just wondered, when you're in Dunedin this time, or maybe next time, you might like to have a think about an interesting source, and that is the records of the Labour Party here in Dunedin. Because the thing that drives us most crazy in some ways a little bit in Dunedin is what I've invented a new word. I call it Aucklandism. And it's a suggestion that the only thing that ever counts in place that counts in New Zealand is Auckland, which is silly nonsense. And one thing that would prove this wrong is the big record that they've got at the Hocken Library, which is held in letters and in part in the Michael Cullen and Stan Rogers collection, but also more generally just Labour Party stuff that will show you that branches around here, lots of them, were continually sending support to David Lange and sometimes criticism to make sure that the thing happened. So there was an awful lot of support, from this little city for the policy, and because it is an old Labour city on the whole, and as a result of that, I think that quite a lot happened, and it might even strengthen your understanding a little bit more, just to give it a little southern flavour, as it were, which would, I think, be quite interesting. Anyway, I'll talk to you about it later.
Anyway, well,
You've been told off.
well, actually, I was going to say, thank you for the suggestion, but I prefer to get my information in Auckland. Sorry. No, thank you for the suggestion.
I think we have a final question here.
Kia ora, thank you so much. have you ever considered standing for politics yourself? Or do you believe that you're more effective in your current role, being outside as a resource person?
Well, you've answered my question. Yes, I think that some people have to be in politics, but this is actually an important comment. It's good to have some people in politics, but they only do a small part of the politics of change. And this is my one objection to MMP, for example, is that the more parties we have, the more emphasis we have on empowerment, the higher proportion of intelligent, motivated people are doing their politics through political parties and parliament. And actually, most change, if we think about it, has come out of movements. Have come out of the researchers and the spokespeople and the organisers and the meeting organisers and the leaflet writers and the MP visitors and all the rest of it. And if we want to have change, we don't need more people in the political process, we need more people in that part. So I should practice what I preach.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful way to end and very inspiring as well. So I have the opportunity here to kind of have the floor and say thank you very much, Nicky, for your wonderful talk. I love the New Zealanders of it, the smallness of New Zealand. Thank you, Bridget O'Flynn, a heroine of New Zealand history who should be remembered. Thank you, Frank O'Flynn, for reaching out to you as well. Thank you for sharing your personal views and being generous with your time. And for answering questions with us as well. And what I took from that is from your talk and from the questions is the need for us to constantly be writing, questioning, thinking, and being critical. And that's what the humanities is about. That's what history is about. So thank you very much for kind of reinforcing the value, I think, of the humanities and the work that we do in universities as well. So I want to just thank you very much for what a wonderful lecture and for spending time with us tonight. So please join me in thanking Nicky Hager. I think a standing ovation is deserved. So I just now had to bring things to a close. I mean, I don't want to kind of stamp down on the kind of awesomeness of this kind of event in terms of the atmosphere itself. But I think what Nicky has done is show us, really importantly, the kind of invisible labour of kind of political work. I think is often forgotten. So thank you for doing that. I also have a few people to thank, apart from Nicky, for helping put this event together. A really critical person is Sandra Burgess, who doesn't like having attention, but she is our administrator in history, and she's made this magic of tonight really happen. So a round of applause for Sandra. Thank you to all the IT people and the External Engagement Division, the Division of Humanities, and everyone out there who's helped kind of promote this event. Thank you, John, very much for all your help in making this happen as well. And thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a real pleasure to be able to host you. So I just want to close with a final karakia, which is Ao ki te rangi, Ao ki te whenua, Ao ki ngā mea katoa, Ti hei Mauri ola. Thank you all.